The desire that even psychoanalysts fear. There is a question that has haunted psychology for over a century, a question asked by one of the most brilliant minds in the history of the unconscious, and yet never truly answered. What does a woman want? Freud posed this question near the end of his life, frustrated, almost defeated, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he was facing something that language itself could not yet hold. Female desire was not just unknown, it was unspeakable. It existed outside the symbolic order, beyond the reach of theory, beyond the vocabulary of patriarchal consciousness, and this is where the labyrinth begins. Not in what Freud discovered, but in what he could not name. Imagine this. A woman sits in a consulting room in Vienna, 1895. She speaks of suffocation, of numbness, of a longing she cannot articulate. Her body trembles, but her words fail. The doctor listens, takes notes, theorizes. He calls it hysteria. He believes it is her womb speaking. But what if it wasn't her womb at all? What if it was her soul, screaming through a body that had been silenced for centuries? Female desire did not emerge as a concept because it was dark or dangerous. It became a labyrinth because it was buried, repressed beneath layers of moral theology, cultural conditioning, and symbolic erasure. For millennia, the feminine was either idealized as virgin or condemned as seductress. There was no language for the woman who simply desired, not for approval, not for survival, but for herself. Freud stumbled upon this void. He saw it in his patients. Women who could not speak their longing, women whose sexuality had been split, permitted only in the service of reproduction, forbidden as autonomous expression. He saw desire operating beneath consciousness, wild and unnamed, producing symptoms because it had no symbolic outlet. And so he asked, "What does a woman want?" But the world was not ready to listen, because to truly hear that question would require dismantling centuries of constructed femininity. It would require acknowledging that female desire was never absent. It was simply exiled, pushed into the shadows, into the body, into the realm of the unsayable. Carl Jung, Freud's once beloved disciple, also touched this mystery. He spoke of the anima, the inner feminine in every psyche. But even Jung struggled to articulate the autonomous feminine desire. He saw woman as mirror, as muse, as container for projection, rarely as sovereign hunger. Marion Woodman, decades later, would write that the feminine body became a battlefield, not because it was weak, but because it held too much power. The power to create, to feel, to desire without permission. And this power had to be controlled, domesticated, made palatable. Listen closely to what I'm about to say. Female desire became dangerous, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. It represented a force that could not be possessed, a hunger that could not be directed, an interior world that refused to perform. And in a civilization built on control, containment, and categorical thinking, this was unacceptable. So the question Freud asked was not just psychological. It was existential. It was revolutionary. And it remains to this day largely unanswered, because to answer it would require us to rebuild the entire architecture of how we understand selfhood, desire, and the feminine soul. This is not a video about Freud. This is a video about what he touched and what the world has refused to feel ever since. The woman who desires, but is not seen. There is a particular kind of wound that does not bleed. It does not announce itself with drama or crisis. It lives quietly, in the space between what is felt and what can be spoken, between what the body knows and what the mind is permitted to acknowledge. This is the wound of desire without reflection, the wound of a woman who feels but has never seen herself mirrored back as a desiring being. Let me tell you a story. A woman in her 30s comes to therapy. She is educated, articulate, successful by every external measure, but she speaks of a persistent numbness. She can perform intimacy, she says, but cannot feel it. She knows what is expected of her in relationships, in sexuality, in connection, but somewhere along the way, she lost access to what she actually wants. "I don't even know what I desire anymore," she whispers. "I only know what I'm supposed to desire." This is not an individual pathology. This is an archetypal fracture. For centuries, female desire existed in a symbolic vacuum. It had no language, no mythology, no sacred space. The feminine was represented in two primary forms: the Virgin Mother, pure and selfless, whose body existed only for others, or the temptress, dangerous and devouring, whose desire was a threat to order. There was no archetype for the woman who simply wanted, not to seduce, not to nurture, not to serve or destroy, but to feel, to long, to hunger as a full autonomous being. Psychoanalyst Jessica Benjamin calls this the problem of mutual recognition. A woman cannot know her own desire if she has never been recognized as a subject of desire, if she has only ever been the object, the one desired, gazed upon, possessed. Then her interior wanting remains formless, unnamed, foreign even to herself. The symbolic mutilation of the feminine is not about bodies, it is about the erasure of interiority. Consider this: when Freud developed his theories, he worked primarily with women who came to him suffering from what he called hysteria. Their symptoms were real: paralysis, blindness, convulsions. But the root was not organic, it was psychic. It was the body speaking what the mind could not. And what was the body saying? I exist, I feel, I want, and I have nowhere to put this. Freud intuited that these women were not sick in the traditional sense. They were symptomatic of a culture that had no container for feminine subjectivity. Their desire had been split off, repressed, exiled into the somatic realm because there was no symbolic home for it. He called this the return of the repressed, but perhaps a better phrase would be the protest of the unmothered soul. In Jungian psychology, there is a concept called the shadow, the part of the psyche that contains everything we cannot consciously accept about ourselves. For many women, desire itself has become shadow, not because it is dark or destructive, but because it was never given permission to exist in the light. Clarissa Pinkola Estes, in Women Who Run with the Wolves, speaks of the instinctual feminine, the wild woman who knows her own hunger, who trusts her intuition, who moves through the world with fierce, unapologetic aliveness. But Estes also notes that this wild woman has been hunted, exiled, forgotten, and in her absence, women learn to perform desire rather than feel it, to respond rather than initiate, to mirror rather than emanate. This is the tragedy Freud could not quite name. He saw women suffering. He saw their bodies expressing what their voices could not, but he lacked the framework to understand that their suffering was not personal. It was archetypal. It was the inheritance of centuries of symbolic absence. There is a difference between being desired and being seen as one who desires. The first makes you an object. The second makes you a subject. And the transition from object to subject is one of the most dangerous journeys a woman can take, because it threatens every structure built on her containment. In the myth of Psyche and Eros, Psyche is forbidden to look at her lover. She can feel him in the dark, but she cannot see him. She must desire in blindness, in obedience, in the realm of the unseen. But Psyche lights a lamp. She breaks the rule. She looks. And in that moment of seeing, she becomes conscious, not just of him, but of herself as one who chooses, who questions, who desires knowledge as much as touch. And for this transgression, she is punished. She must descend into the underworld. She must endure trial after trial, not because she was wrong, but because consciousness always demands sacrifice. This is the initiatory path of feminine desire. It is not given, it is reclaimed, through rupture, through rebellion, through the terrifying act of saying I want, not I should want, not I am supposed to want, but simply I want. And the world, even now, does not quite know what to do with that sentence. James Hillman, the archetypal psychologist, spoke of the need to stick with the image, to allow symbols, dreams, bodily sensations to speak before rushing to interpret them, to fix them, to domesticate them into meaning. What if female desire is still in the image stage, still dreaming itself into language, still searching for its own symbolic form? What if the reason Freud could not answer his own question is because the answer was never meant to be theoretical? It was meant to be lived, felt in the body, witnessed in relationship, honored as sacred, not pathologized as symptom. The archetypal wound is this: to desire in a world that has no mirror for your desiring, to hunger in a culture that only recognizes your hunger when it serves someone else, to feel the pulse of your own aliveness, and be told implicitly or explicitly that this pulse is too much, too wild, too dangerous. So you learn to quiet it. You learn to translate it into something acceptable, something controllable. And in that translation, you lose the original language, the language your soul was born speaking, the theory that dared to touch the flesh of the soul. Freud was not a prophet. He was a cartographer, mapping territories that had no names, territories that existed in the psyche like underground rivers, felt but never seen, powerful but never acknowledged. And in his mapping he made mistakes, profound, controversial, sometimes devastating mistakes. But he also made contact with something true, something that still pulses beneath every theory that came after him. Let us speak of the most notorious concept: penis envy. The idea that young girls, upon discovering anatomical difference, feel a sense of lack, a wound, an absence that shapes their entire psychological development. This theory has been criticized, rejected, reinterpreted and dismantled by generations of thinkers, and rightfully so, because taken literally, it is absurd, reductive, a projection of male-centered psychology onto the feminine psyche. But what if we look beneath the surface? What if penis envy was never about anatomy at all, but about symbolic power? What if Freud, in his clumsy Victorian language, was actually pointing to something real, the girl's awakening to the fact that in her culture, in her family, in the symbolic order she was born into, the masculine holds the place of agency, authority, autonomy, that the phallus is not a body part, but a symbol of the power to name, to choose, to move through the world as subject rather than object. And the girl, in recognizing this, does not envy the organ itself. She grieves the absence of recognition for her own subjectivity. This is what Jacques Lacan tried to articulate decades later. The phallus, he said, is not the penis. It is the signifier of desire, of lack, of what can never be fully possessed. And both men and women are structured by this lack, this longing, this gap between what we are and what we imagine we could be. But Lacan too struggled to give the feminine its own symbolic place. He spoke of woman as not all, not fully captured by language, not fully contained by the symbolic order. This could be read as liberation. Woman exists beyond the limits of patriarchal discourse. Or it could be read as another erasure. Woman as eternally outside, mysterious, unspeakable. Freud sensed this tension. He knew he was working with a psyche shaped by culture, by history, by the specific wounds of a civilization that had split the feminine into virgin and whore, Madonna and Magdalene, nurture and seduction. And he tried, within the constraints of his own historical moment, to give voice to what he heard in his consulting room. Women speaking of desires they could not name, fantasies they felt ashamed of, hungers that did not fit the script of feminine propriety. One of his patients, whom he called Dora, came to him with a constellation of symptoms: chronic cough, loss of voice, fainting spells. She was brought by her father, who wanted Freud to cure her of her hysterical refusal to accept the advances of a family friend. Freud listened to Dora's dreams. He heard beneath her symptoms a story of betrayal, of being used as currency in adult negotiations, of her own desire being completely disregarded. And yet even Freud, in his analysis, could not fully see her. He interpreted her refusal as repressed desire for the man. He believed she unconsciously wanted what she consciously rejected. Dora left treatment abruptly, and decades later, feminist psychoanalysts would return to her case and see what Freud could not. That Dora was not repressing desire for the man. She was protesting the erasure of her own subjectivity. She was refusing to be an object in someone else's erotic economy. Her symptoms were not pathology. They were resistance. This is the edge where Freud's brilliance met his blindness. He saw that the unconscious spoke through the body. He understood that sexuality was not just biological, but symbolic, psychological, tied to identity and selfhood. But he could not escape his own cultural conditioning. He could not see feminine desire as anything other than a response to, or deviation from, masculine desire. He could not imagine a libido that was not structured around lack, envy, or the masculine as referent. And yet, he asked the question, what does a woman want? This question, in itself, was revolutionary, because it implied that woman's desire was not already known, not already decided, not reducible to motherhood, to marriage, to serving as vessel for masculine need. It implied that there was an interior world in woman that remained mysterious, autonomous, perhaps even unknowable. Rollo May, the existential psychologist, wrote that anxiety arises when we confront our own freedom, when we realize that we are not determined, not fixed, not merely reactive, but capable of choice, of creation, of self-authorship. For many women, the anxiety is double-layered. It is not just the anxiety of freedom. It is the anxiety of claiming freedom in a world that was not built to recognize it. To desire as a woman, authentically, is to step outside the known. It is to risk being seen as too much, too hungry, too sexual, too selfish, too wild. It is to face the internalized voice that says, good women do not want, they are wanted. Freud intuited this conflict. He saw women caught between instinct and superego, between bodily knowing and moral conditioning. He saw them splitting themselves in half to survive the contradiction, and he tried to build a theory that could hold this. But theory alone cannot hold what has been exiled for centuries. What Freud began and what we are still unraveling is this: feminine desire is not secondary. It is not derivative. It is not a lesser or distorted version of masculine libido. It is its own force, its own intelligence, its own sacred, undomesticated current. And it has been seeking language, seeking form, seeking recognition, not just in psychoanalysis, but in art, in myth, in the dreams and the bodies of women who refuse to perform numbness any longer. The anatomy Freud was truly mapping was not the body. It was the soul's longing to be seen, not as object, not as mirror, not as lack, but as presence, as hunger, as sovereign territory. If this is touching something in you, something you felt but never had words for, leave a comment below. Tell me, what does your soul hunger for that you've never spoken aloud? Your words matter here. This is a space where the unspeakable can finally breathe. The body that felt before the mind could know. There is a woman who cannot feel pleasure. She is in her late 20s. She has had relationships, been intimate, gone through all the motions that are supposed to lead to connection. But somewhere inside, there is a wall, a numbness, a quiet absence where sensation should be. She does not speak of this easily. When she does, she uses careful language, clinical language. I think I'm just not very sexual, she says. Or maybe I'm just wired differently. But beneath those words is a deeper truth, one she has not yet touched. Her body learned long ago that desire was dangerous, not through a single event, not through anything she could point to and say, there, that's where it happened, but through 1,000 small moments. A mother's disapproval when she danced too freely as a child, a teacher's correction when she laughed too loudly. The way boys looked at her when her body began to change, not with curiosity but with possession. The subtle message repeated endlessly, "Your aliveness is acceptable only when it serves others." So her body learned to quiet itself, to numb, to protect, to survive by becoming less. This is what Freud called hysteria, but it was never hysteria. It was adaptive genius. The body speaking a truth the mind could not yet afford to know. In the late 1800s, when Freud was developing his theories, the women who came to him were not simply neurotic. They were symptomatically sane in an insane world. Their bodies were protesting conditions that their conscious minds had been taught to accept as normal. Paralysis of the legs, "I cannot walk the path laid out for me." Loss of voice, "I have no permission to speak my truth." Blindness, "I cannot bear to see what is being asked of me." Freud, to his credit, recognized that these symptoms were meaningful, that they were communications from a deeper intelligence. He developed the concept of conversion, the idea that unbearable psychic content converts into bodily symptom. But what he did not fully grasp was this. For women, the unbearable content was often desire itself, not repressed sexual longing in the narrow sense, but the full spectrum of feminine vitality, the hunger to be seen, to be autonomous, to move through the world with unmediated aliveness. This vitality had no place, so it became symptom. The contemporary understanding of trauma gives us new language for this. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, in his groundbreaking work on trauma and the body, describes how traumatic experience is stored not just in memory, but in the nervous system. The body keeps the score, he says. It remembers what the mind tries to forget. And for many women, the trauma is not a single event. It is the cumulative weight of existing in a body that has been objectified, commodified, controlled, and denied its own authority. This is what the polyvagal theory helps us understand. The nervous system has multiple responses to threat: fight, flight, freeze, and a lesser-known fourth response, fawn, the impulse to appease, to please, to make oneself smaller and more palatable to avoid danger. For countless women, fawn became the default mode, not because they were weak, but because they were brilliant survivors in an environment where direct resistance carried consequences. And the cost of this survival strategy? The severance from one's own desire. Because to know what you want, to feel what you feel, requires a degree of safety, a degree of internal permission, a belief that your wanting will not result in punishment, abandonment, or annihilation. Without that safety, the psyche does something radical. It stops wanting, it goes numb, it dissociates, it fragments, and the woman finds herself living a kind of half-life, functional on the surface, dying on the inside. Let me tell you another story. A woman in her 40s begins to have panic attacks. They come without warning, often during intimacy with her partner. Her heart races, her breath becomes shallow. She feels an overwhelming urge to flee. She goes to doctors. They find nothing physically wrong. She goes to therapists. They suggest anxiety medication. But one therapist asks a different question. What does your body remember that your mind has forgotten? And slowly, through somatic therapy, through gentle inquiry, a memory surfaces, not of abuse, not of violence, but of invisibility, of being a young girl whose desires, whose preferences, whose no's were consistently overridden. "You don't really feel that way," her mother would say. "You're just being dramatic." Her nervous system learned, "My inner knowing is not trustworthy, my desires are invalid." And decades later, when intimacy required her to be present in her body, to feel, to want, her nervous system responded with terror, because presence meant vulnerability, and vulnerability, her body believed, meant erasure. This is the silent trauma that Freud intuited, but could not fully articulate, the trauma of being denied subjectivity, of having your desire interpreted, redirected, dismissed, or pathologized. Marion Woodman, the Jungian analyst who worked extensively with women and embodiment, spoke of the anorexic soul, not just in relation to eating disorders, but as a broader metaphor for the feminine psyche starved of its own nourishment. Women, she observed, had learned to distrust their hunger, to see desire as greed, to equate wanting with being bad, selfish, dangerous, and so they starved themselves. Not just of food, but of pleasure, of rest, of authentic expression. They became what Woodman called spiritual anorexics, disciplined, controlled, perfectionistic, and utterly disconnected from the wisdom of the instinctual body. The path back, Woodman insisted, was not through more discipline, it was through dissent, through allowing the body to speak, through honoring its symptoms not as problems to fix, but as messages to receive, through learning slowly and tenderly that desire is not the enemy, it is the compass. In somatic psychology, there is a concept called pendulation, the gentle oscillation between activation and rest, between feeling and releasing, between contraction and expansion. Healing happens not by forcing the body to feel what it has shut down, but by creating enough safety that it can begin to soften, to thaw, to remember that aliveness is not synonymous with danger. For many women, reclaiming desire is not a mental process, it is a bodily one. It is learning to feel again, to sense, to notice the subtle language of yes and no that lives beneath thought. It is distinguishing between the desire that arises from within and the desire that has been conditioned from without. It is asking, what do I want? Not because I should, not because it would please someone else, but because my soul is calling for it. This question, so simple on the surface, can be revolutionary, because to answer it truthfully requires listening to a voice that has been silenced, a knowing that has been dismissed, a hunger that has been shamed into hiding. Clarissa Pinkola Estes speaks of the wild woman archetype, the instinctual feminine who knows her own rhythms, her own boundaries, her own fierce and tender intelligence. But this wild woman, Estes reminds us, does not return through effort or willpower. She returns through invitation, through creating space for her to emerge, through sitting with the discomfort of not knowing, through allowing rage, grief, longing, all the exiled emotions to move through the body and be witnessed. The body that felt before the mind could know is the body that still knows even now, even beneath the numbness, even beneath the fear, even beneath the years of conditioning. It remembers the language of desire. It remembers what it is to be alive, unmediated, untamed, and it is waiting, not for permission, but for recognition. When desire becomes compass, not sentence. There comes a moment in every awakening when the old structures no longer hold, when the inherited map of who you should be, what you should want, how you should move through the world, begins to dissolve, and in that dissolution there is terror, because you realize you have been living by coordinates that were never yours. But there is also something else, a quiet stirring, a pulse, a whisper from a place so deep within you that it feels both ancient and newborn. This is the beginning of reclamation, not of desire as impulse, not as reaction, not as compensation for what was denied, but desire as sacred intelligence, desire as the language your soul has been speaking all along. Let me tell you about a woman named Elena. She came to therapy in her mid-30s, exhausted. She had built a life that looked successful from the outside, a stable career, a long-term relationship, a circle of friends, but she described feeling hollow. "I've been performing my life," she said, "but I don't know if I've ever lived it." The therapist asked her to try something, for 1 week to simply notice what her body wanted, not what she thought she should want, not what would be productive or responsible, but what her body, in any given moment, was genuinely calling for. Eleanor resisted at first. "That seems selfish," she said, "indulgent." But she tried, and what she discovered surprised her. Her body wanted rest, deep, unscheduled rest. It wanted to walk slowly. It wanted to sit in silence without filling the space with distraction. It wanted to say no to obligations, to social events, to the relentless pace she had maintained for years. And beneath all of that, there was something else, a longing she had never allowed herself to feel. She wanted to paint, not professionally, not with any goal or outcome, but simply to move color across canvas, to enter that timeless space where the mind quiets and something older takes over. She had not painted since she was a child. It seemed frivolous, she said, like something I didn't have time for, but the desire persisted. And finally, she listened. She bought paints. She set up a small corner in her apartment, and she began, not with skill, not with certainty, but with presence. And as she painted, something shifted. She began to feel herself again, not the self she had constructed to meet external expectations, but the self that existed before the conditioning, the self that knew instinctively what fed her soul. This is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are rather than who you were taught to be. And for women, this process is not neutral. It is initiatory, because it requires dismantling the false self that was built on the denial of desire. In Jungian psychology, there is an understanding that the psyche naturally seeks wholeness, that the unconscious will send signals, through dreams, through symptoms, through persistent longings, when we are living out of alignment with our essential nature. Desire, from this perspective, is not random. It is purposeful. It is the psyche's way of guiding us back to ourselves. But most of us were never taught to trust this guidance. We were taught to distrust desire, to see it as selfish, dangerous, unreliable, to override it with reason, with duty, with the endless calculus of what others need from us. And in that overriding, we lost the thread that connects us to our own aliveness. James Hillman, the archetypal psychologist, spoke of soul-making, the idea that the purpose of life is not to solve problems or achieve perfection, but to deepen, to become more fully who we are. And desire, Hillman suggested, is one of the primary ways the soul speaks. Not the desire manufactured by advertising or social conditioning, but the eros that pulls us toward what genuinely enlivens us, toward beauty, toward meaning, toward connection, toward the things that make us feel most real. This distinction is crucial because we live in a culture saturated with false desire that has been commodified, packaged, sold back to us as products to consume. Desire that promises fulfillment but delivers only temporary distraction. Authentic desire is different. It does not promise, it does not seduce, it does not need to be loud, it simply persists. It is the quiet knowing that returns again and again, even when ignored. The whisper that says, "This matters, this is yours, this is part of your soul's curriculum." So how do we distinguish between authentic desire and conditioned wanting? How do we learn to hear the soul's voice amid the noise? One practice comes from the tradition of focusing, developed by philosopher Eugene Gendlin. It involves what he called the felt sense, a bodily awareness that is more subtle than emotion, more holistic than thought. To access the felt sense of desire, you pause, you quiet the analytical mind. You bring your attention into your body and you ask, what wants to emerge? What is asking for attention? And then you wait, not for answers, but for images, sensations, a quality of energy. Perhaps you feel an opening in your chest, or a tightness, or a warmth, and you stay with that sensation, allowing it to reveal itself. This is not about interpreting, it is about listening to the body as if it were an oracle, because it is. Another practice comes from the shamanic traditions, particularly those explored by Clarissa Pinkola Estes. She speaks of La Loba, the wolf woman who collects bones and sings them back to life. This is a metaphor for the work of reclaiming the instinctual self. We gather the fragments, the desires we abandoned, the dreams we dismissed, the parts of ourselves we left behind in order to be acceptable, to be safe, and we sing to them, not with force, not with urgency, but with tenderness, with patience, with the recognition that what was lost can over time return. There is also the practice that Jung called active imagination, a form of meditative engagement with the unconscious. You might imagine yourself entering a landscape, a forest, a desert, a cave, and you allow a figure to appear, an image, a presence, and you ask, "What do you want to show me? What have I been refusing to see?" And then you listen, you dialogue. You allow the unconscious to speak in its own symbolic language. For many women, what emerges in these dialogues is not what they expected, not grand revelations, not dramatic transformations, but quiet truths. You want rest, you want solitude, you want to be touched with presence, not performance. You want to create something that has no practical use. You want to grieve what was never mourned. These desires may seem small, unremarkable, but they are not. They are the stones that, when honored, rebuild the bridge between the exiled self and the lived life. Rumi, the Sufi poet, wrote, "Let yourself be silently drawn by the strange pull of what you really love. It will not lead you astray." This is the essence of desire as compass, not as compulsion, not as addiction, not as the frantic grasping for what we think will complete us, but as the gentle, persistent pull toward what genuinely nourishes us, toward what makes us feel more alive, more present, more connected to the sacred current that runs through all things. The river metaphor is useful here. Imagine desire not as a flood that destroys, but as a river that knows where it is going. A river does not force, it flows. It moves around obstacles. It shapes the landscape over time, not through violence, but through persistence. When we resist the river, we create dams. We create stagnation. We create the conditions for explosion. But when we learn to flow with it, to honor its direction, to trust its intelligence, we become part of something larger than our small, frightened egos. We become part of the great unfolding. The undomesticated feminine is not chaos. It is coherence. A coherence that the rational mind, trained in linear control, cannot comprehend. But the body knows, the soul knows, and they have been waiting with infinite patience for us to remember. To remember that desire is not the enemy of the spiritual life. It is the doorway, the invitation, the sacred yes that leads us home to ourselves. What Freud touched and the world refused to feel. We have traveled far together, through the labyrinth of unnamed longing, through the archaeology of a desire that was buried before it could speak, through the wound of existing without a mirror and the slow, tender work of reclamation. And now we arrive at the threshold, the place where understanding must become embodiment, where theory dissolves into lived experience. Freud asked a question that still echoes through the corridors of consciousness. What does a woman want? But perhaps the question was never meant to be answered by theory. Perhaps it was meant to be answered by each woman, in the privacy of her own becoming, in the sacred solitude where the soul finally permits itself to speak. There is a reason this question has haunted us for over a century. Not because it is unanswerable, but because the answer threatens everything. Every structure built on feminine containment, every system that requires women to be mirrors rather than fires, every ideology that depends on desire being predictable, controllable, domesticated. To truly hear what a woman wants, what you want, is to acknowledge a sovereignty that the world has not been willing to grant. It is to recognize that feminine desire is not derivative, not secondary, not a response to masculine initiation. It is its own cosmology, its own sacred territory, its own uncharted wilderness. And wilderness, by definition, cannot be tamed without being destroyed. Listen to what I'm about to say, because this is the heart of everything. To desire is not to deviate, it is to return to the original blueprint of your soul before it was edited by fear, by shame, by the 1,000 invisible hands that shaped you into something more palatable. You were not born apologizing for your hunger. You learned that. You were not born performing desire for an audience. You learned that. You were not born believing that your wanting was dangerous, excessive, wrong. You learned that. And what was learned can be unlearned. Not through force, not through more discipline or self-improvement, but through the radical act of listening. Listening to the body that speaks in whispers, to the dreams that arrive unbidden, to the longings that surface in moments of stillness and refuse to be dismissed. There is a practice I want to offer you, not as technique, not as solution, but as invitation. Tonight, before you sleep, sit in the dark for a few moments. No phone, no distraction, just you and the silence. And place your hand on your heart. Feel it beating. Feel the life force moving through you, without permission, without apology. And ask very gently, what does my soul want me to know? Do not search for answers. Do not try to make meaning, just listen. And notice what arises. It may be an image, a sensation, a memory, a name, a color. It may be nothing at all. That is fine. You're not trying to solve anything. You are simply opening a door that has been closed. You are letting your desire know that it is welcome here, that it will not be judged, analyzed, or dismissed, that you are ready, finally, to hear it. This is the beginning of reconstruction, not of who you should be, but of who you already are beneath the layers of conditioning. The woman Freud could not see clearly was not absent. She was simply waiting for a world that could hold her without needing to contain her, waiting for language that could name her without reducing her, waiting for permission that she realizes now she never actually needed, because permission is not granted from outside. It rises from within, from the place that Jung called the self, the deep center of the psyche that knows its own truth, its own path, its own timing. And when you begin to listen to that center, something shifts. The question stops being, what do I want? And becomes, what wants to be lived through me? This is the movement from ego to soul, from personal desire to sacred calling, from the small self that grasps to the larger self that receives. Joseph Campbell spoke of following your bliss, but he did not mean hedonism or escapism. He meant following the thread of what genuinely enlivens you, what makes you feel most aligned with your deepest nature. And that thread, when followed, does not lead to selfishness. It leads to service, to meaning, to the place where your gifts meet the world's need. But first, you must allow yourself to want, to feel, to hunger, to long, without shame, without apology, without needing to justify or explain. Hildegard of Bingen, the medieval mystic, spoke of viriditas, the greening power, the life force that moves through all things, seeking expression, seeking fullness, seeking bloom. This greening power lives in you. It is not dormant, it is not broken. It is simply waiting for you to stop pruning it back, to stop shaping it into something safe, to let it grow wild according to its own intelligence. Freud touched this power. He sensed it in the women who came to him, carrying desires they could not name, symptoms that spoke what words could not. He tried to map it with the tools he had, and he failed in many ways. But the failure was not his alone. It was civilization's failure, language's failure, the failure of a symbolic order that had no container for autonomous feminine desire. And we are still living in the aftermath of that failure, still learning how to speak what was unspeakable, still learning how to feel what was forbidden, still learning that desire, when honored, does not destroy. It illuminates, it guides, it initiates, it transforms. There is a reason the divine feminine has been depicted across cultures as both creator and destroyer. not because she is chaotic, but because she is transformative. She does not preserve the old forms out of fear. She allows them to die so that something new can be born. And this is what your desire is calling you toward. Not toward recklessness, not toward abandonment of all structure, but toward a more authentic form. A life that is yours, a self that is real, a wanting that is true. The question Freud asked still lingers in the air, unanswered. What does a woman want? But perhaps you now understand why it cannot be answered collectively, because every woman's desire is its own oracle, its own revelation, its own sacred text, written in a language only she can fully decode. Your task is not to answer for all women, it is to answer for yourself. And the answer will not come through thinking, it will come through feeling, through listening, through the slow, patient work of allowing what has been exiled to return, through trusting that the desire you feel, however strange, however inconvenient, however far from what you thought you should want, is not arbitrary. It is intelligent, it is purposeful, it is your soul calling you home. So I leave you with this. Female desire does not seek answers. It seeks space to remember what it knew before the world taught it to forget, space to remember its own wildness, its own wisdom, its own sacred authority. And in that remembering, everything changes. If these words touch something deep within you, I need to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me, what part of your desire have you been silencing? Your voice matters. Your story matters. And this community is here to witness it. If you're not already subscribed, please subscribe now. This channel is a sanctuary for the soul, and I want you to be part of this journey. And when you're ready, watch the next video I've recommended for you. We're going deeper. We're going further into the territories that most never dare to explore. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for having the courage to feel. Until we meet again in the next reflection, may you remember what your soul has always known.